All right, everyone, welcome back. We're going to get into our next topic, which is 8.2, the Cold War. So, one of my favorite topics in history. And so, we're going to break it down the key concepts that you'll need to know for AP World and some of the elaboration on the information that relate to those. Okay. So, let's talk about first of the essential questions. Again, these are questions that you'll need to answer in the Canvas page, just to kind of clarify that you did this, understood it, and so forth. And it is a short little assignment. So, number one, how did the Cold War shape the modern world? And then two, to what extent did the Cold War involve the entire world? And so we're going to talk about some of that today. That's something that probably will continue to other ones, but for the purpose of answering these questions, make sure you just answer them as related to the information that we talk about today, because it does get longer and more complex as time goes on. So let's get back to this is the writing of the curriculum. The global balance of economic and political power shifted during and after World War II and rapidly evolved in the Cold War. Some of the stuff that we kind of talked about in the 8.1, setting the stage, we already kind of covered that already to some extent. The democracy of the United States and the authoritarian communist Soviet Union emerged as the superpowers, which led to the ideological conflict and power struggle between capitalism and communism across the world. So, to kind of define the Cold War a little more detail and such, it is an ideological struggle between communism and capitalism. And democracy and authoritarianism. That's something that is going to make up majority of what the Cold War is about. It never amounts to an actual full-on war, but there was competitions and other things, and there are some hot spots in this war, which we'll talk about a little bit more today. The one big thing that you should know is that the ideas of the competition for spheres of influence. What I mean by that is they have more influence on the governments, lifestyles, everything, all in the above, between the United States and other countries, and or the United States and the Soviet Union over the influence over other countries, to be kind of their closer allies and so forth. This does eventually lead to some proxy wars, a few of which we'll talk about today, Korea, Vietnam, stuff that goes on in Latin America as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. It also includes the science race, a tech race, oftentimes referred to as the space race. One of my favorite things to talk about in history, and I'm going to have to, for the purpose of this video, not boring you too much, but the space race was really, really fascinating, and it really kind of starts off with the Soviets being the first to be able to launch a man-made object into orbit of the Earth, and that was a little satellite known as Sputnik. It wasn't very big. It was just basically an orb with some antennas that came out of it, and all it did was basically send out a signal, a beep, 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 that it was up there. And this scared the heck out of the Americans because, first of all, there was a lot of frantic Americans who thought, oh my gosh, is that a nuclear bomb up there? Is it spying on us? Things like that. But more importantly, it represented that we had fallen behind on the science race. So we started to try to catch up, and we developed NASA. The goal was to try to get the first man into space and return him safely to the Earth, but the Russians beat us on that. Then we pretty much changed the finishing line to the moon. And so we put a lot of resources. It's basically America's largest science project that we've ever done, and one of the most expensive that we've ever taken part of, to be able to send men to the moon and return them safely to the Earth. And even though the Russians beat us in pretty much everything, with the exception of a few things, orbiting the moon and putting two men in space at a time, and the moon itself, moon landing itself, we did kind of declare ourselves victors in the space race itself. But definitely the competition between our two countries helped develop science even further so, because each was trying to outdo the other. The arms race that we've talked about a little bit in 8.1, the building up of our militaries, the military-industrial complex, and as well as the development of nuclear weapons. Both sides are going to develop so many nuclear weapons. I think, if I remember correctly, both sides develop enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world. I think it's 7 times over. I'm not 100% certain on that, but certainly both sides build up huge nuclear arms and the ability to launch them by air, by land, and by sea, and something that kind of happened more and more so. course, there's like the spy games, that comes really a lot with Hollywood. And, like James Bond himself is supposed to be a product of the Cold War, spying on Russia. And then, of course, it develops into something much, much more different type of James Bond today than you will see in the early days of James Bond. But lots of spy games, espionage that goes on. The Russians did their own espionage too. Lots of Hollywood and TV shows about stuff like that. And there's also this economic competition. We talked about last time the soft power, and both sides are trying to prove that their model of economics is superior to the others. And so there's a lot of things that go on as far as competition between these. And it even kind of extends to something we call the kitchen debates. And so in the picture here, we have Nikita Khrushchev, who is the Soviet premier that replaced Joseph Stalin when Stalin dies. And this is Vice President Richard Nixon. Of course, many of you probably know he does become president and the only president to resign. And, this is in 1959 in Moscow. And it was the national exhibition in Moscow, in a park in Moscow, where like something was set up, and basically it was to kind of show the American life. And so they set up kind of what the daily American life looks like. And, Richard Nixon comes out there to kind of oversee it. It was the first time a vice president or president had visited Moscow in a very, very long time. And so it was kind of a big deal. But the reason why I mention this is that this picture is kind of iconic, that both these men were standing in front of this exhibition, and this basically was the American kitchen. And of course, in the American kitchen, we have at this time and still today, a refrigerator, dishwasher, all these little gadgets that make life more convenient. And so, in the Soviet Union, they tended to focus on the basic necessities. And so these two men debated about what's the purposes. Nikita Khrushchev is basically, this is all luxury. These are items you don't need. It's materialism. It's, not focusing on the basics. You're putting all the resources into these things rather than taking care of all your people, yada, yada. Richard Nixon is, arguing back, about, how this makes life better and more convenient, yada, yada. And so this whole kitchen debate, exemplifies the viewpoints and differences between the two worlds that you see here between communism and capitalism, and what they think is important in life. So there's a number of international conflicts that take place as a result of the Cold War and such. And, we talked about after World War II in our previous topic, that there was pretty much a divide in Europe as the allies of the UK, France, Canada, United States began to liberate Western Europe. The Eastern European bloc and the European countries were liberated by the Soviet Union. And when they did get in there, they helped establish communist governments and puppet governments that share the same communist ideals. Now, if you remember and recall, the reason why they did this or justify doing this is they wanted some sort of buffer zone between them and Germany. And of course, Poland, Czechoslovakia could offer that buffer between them. But, in stark reality also is that they wanted to try to create more spheres of influence and to gain more universalization of communism, as they saw was a superior model of government and economics to Western capitalism and democracy. So they wanted more countries to kind of fall in line with their line of thinking. And that gave them a shift of balance of power if they can get more countries on part of that. So as a result, after World War II, these Eastern Bloc countries do become satellite nations of the Soviet Union. The governments in each one of these countries of the Soviet Bloc, sans Yugoslavia here, were aligned with the Soviet Union and took marching orders from Moscow in a way to basically, establish, their economics, their military, and so forth to somehow benefit the Soviet Union. And the Soviets supported, the spread of more communism around the world and such. And so for the Western powers, they viewed the Soviets as a threat to their way of life, a threat to spread even further and then take more control of countries. And then, of course, the United States loses that balance of power because they have less countries in their corner than the Soviets do. And so that was something they're very fearful for. So as a result, there's going to be a policy that gets developed, and the United States is going to follow this policy very much so. It's called containment, and it starts with a U.S. diplomat named George Kennan, who basically was the ambassador to Moscow, and he writes a letter to Harry Truman, the president, and says that communists are expansionists. They're trying to take over the world. If they do that, it'll be very bad for the United States. And so they need to do something to stop that. So in 1947, Truman, who gives a very strong statement against his former ally, basically says we are going to commit $400 million to stopping the spread of communism into countries like Turkey and Greece. And where the Soviets were supporting communist guerrillas in those states to topple their governments and make them a communist government, the United States is going to find supporters of a different way of life. I wouldn't necessarily say capitalism such democracy, but certainly more along the lines of our ideology. And so they committed $400 million to help them, give them economic support as well as military support to fight against communism. Later down the line, the United States also commits roughly $12 billion in economic aid to help rebuild Europe. Of course, Europe was devastated after the war, and the concern was if we leave them to their own devices, without any help and influence from our side, you can see a rise of extremist viewpoints like they saw after World War I with fascism. And it wasn't fascism that they were really worried about as much as they were worried about communism, and they didn't want to create breeding grounds for communist, leaders and communist guerrillas and such to come in and topple those governments in favor of communist governments. So $12 billion to help rebuild. It was almost like the New Deal, where they give economic support to help build the economy in a capitalistic, free market system, so to say. And so the money was given to or was offered to all of Europe, including Eastern Europe, but many of them had rejected that pretty much probably the direction of the Soviets. And they, the Soviets create their own type of example of, helping them economically rebuild. It was called the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. But in comparison to the Marshall Plan, it was much less money and support. And so, this was something you could see on the cultural landscape after World War II. When you go to a place like Berlin, where it was divided into two parts, East and West, the West was much better rebuilt after World War II. The East still had buildings that were bombed out from the bombing campaigns by the Allies. It was very apparent, who was getting a better deal in the end. And so that does create issues in Berlin. We'll talk about it a little bit. So something we'll talk more about in the next unit as well was the idea of these new alliances are created. And, these aren't the only ones, but these are the big ones that you should know about. It's North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also as NATO, and the Warsaw Pact. And so NATO was created because the feeling was that the Iron Curtain had basically descended onto Europe. And so there was East and West. And so the fear of the expansionist ideas of the Soviets that kind of lead to the ideas of containment. How do you better contain the spread of communism? You deter them by any means necessary. And so in 1949, the Soviets had been able to develop their own atomic bomb. And so the United States also counters with the idea that we need to create an alliance system to protect any potential spreading of the Soviets into Western Europe by creating an alliance system. And Article 5, I think it is, of that alliance basically says that if one country is attacked, then all will come to their defense. And That is still true today. NATO still has those ideas still in place. So this was the idea of deterrence and such. If the Soviets were ever to kind of invade a country, say West Germany, then as a result, all of the countries would organize and work together to repel any potential invasion of the Soviets. The Soviets saw this differently. They looked at the North Atlantic Treaty Organization as an alliance of aggression that they were setting themselves up to eventually invade them. So to protect themselves, the Warsaw Pact was created, and this is mostly the Eastern Bloc states and the Soviet Union, which there was kind of military support across the board, and then of course they would all kind of work together to repel any invasion the Western European and the United States would come with. All right, so moving on, the curriculum that says that groups and individuals, including the non-alignment movement, opposed and promoted alternatives to the existing economic, political, and social orders. So the non-alignment movement is important to note. It's directly from the curriculum, but also that not all of the world broke into who's going to be on the side of the United States and who's going to be on the side of the Soviet Union. There were a lot of countries, especially some of the most populated countries in the world, that didn't want to align with either, and they wanted to work together as nations rather than work, with one of the two major superpowers. So this is true. Much of the global North was part of the alliances and Cold War itself, supporting the United States or the Soviet Union. But the global South, very, very different. Most of them are not going to align with either side, and they want to stay out of the Cold War altogether. So this alternative framework that was created, this international cooperation, through working through economics and creating some sort of ideas of social order and such, really kicks off in 1955 in Indonesia. The Bandung Conference in Indonesia. You had basically delegates from countries China, India, and 27 other countries. And China, India, the two most populated countries in the world. And Indonesia is where they're holding it, is the fourth most populated country in the world. So, a lot of people in the world have basically committed to not commit to either one of the superpowers. And they are going to try to keep away from it. So, in this meeting, they basically passed a resolution condemning colonialism, things of the past. Some of them even saw this whole new Cold War and the fight between the superpowers as a new form of imperialism. And so they want to condemn it outright. And this kind of leads to the establishment of what becomes known as the non-alignment movement. So, member states end up pushing for more international institutions, like the United Nations, to work for countries to work together to solve issues that affect all mankind. But regardless of the pushing for these intra-national organizations, they do kind of deal with some problems and such. Like some states, even though they're not part of the non-aligned movement and they're promoting this idea of international cooperation, they still are, they're got their own problems they've got to deal with. And, one example would be India, where India is very much a part and big leaders inside the non-aligned movement, and want the United Nations to be part of things more so. They refused to allow peacekeepers to come into the region of Kashmir, which was a territory that was disputed between them and Pakistan after the partition of India following their independence in 1947. And that's an issue that still is around today. And so even though they're like, we want more of the UN, but when it comes to us, we're not in favor of them coming and interfering with our issues and so forth. So that was something that happened. And then at the same time, a lot of the non-alignment members did at some point kind of work with the United States or the Soviet Union, sometimes both. And so they didn't stay completely out of the Cold War or completely away from those superpowers in the end. But it is important to note that many of the countries did not involve themselves in this whole Cold War era and what happened there. So continuing on, something else that comes from the cricket, groups and individuals, including the non-aligned movement, opposed and promoted alternatives to economic, political, and social orders. So we're going to talk about some individuals here. So the first one is Sukarno of Indonesia. He's the one who was the first president of Indonesia once it became independent from essentially Dutch control. And so he was the one who also organized and hosted the Bandung Conference. And he was extremely critical of the United States and the USSR, for the things they do, bringing us to the brink of the end of mankind, things like that. And so he was a big proponent and leader within the non-alignment movement to try to move the rest of the world away from these two superpowers. But in the end, he also did accept aid from both countries, to try to help establish his new country, which, if you're going to create a new country, you try to make friends with powerful people, powerful nations. And in doing so, he kind of aligned himself with both of them, but neither of them at the same time. All right. So Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, also an important leader within this non-alignment movement. His big contribution, and he'll come up later on, but he was a big advocate for this idea of Pan-Africanism, something that has been around all the way back from the early 1900s. But this idea that despite the breaking up of Africa into multiple colonies, which would become multiple countries, many countries, he's promoted this idea of a unity, economically, politically, socially, culturally, of all Africans, and something that is still around today, this idea of Pan-Africanism. It still kind of pops up now and again, but, he helped kind of was the Organization of African Unity. Today we have the African Union, which is made up of, I think, 54 African countries, pretty much all of them, working together for issues that go on in Africa itself, whether it be civil wars, pandemics, economic recessions, economic issues, and so forth, refugees. It's kind of like a smaller version of the United Nations, mainly for the African continent. All right, I'm going to see if I can get this pronunciation right. So, Jawaharlal Nehru of India. He's the first president of India, first prime minister, I should say, not president, from 1947 to 1964. The independence of India from the British Empire came with some costs, and we'll talk some of those more so later. But a lot of people kind of assume that Mahatma Gandhi is the first president, but Gandhi himself was actually killed by a Hindu extremist. Because Gandhi promoted this idea of both Muslims and Hindus living in India, what was India, but is now India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, all together. It didn't happen that way. And he was kind of trying to push the idea that Muslims and Hindus are more in common than not, and in the idea of Indian nationalism, over the religion itself. And it didn't play out that way. One of the more extreme members of this Hindu nationalist movement that he was competing against ends up becoming enraged by his ideas of unity and cooperation, and ends up getting killed for it. So Nehru is going to promote the idea of a stronger United Nations as well. And as I mentioned not too long ago, that despite the fact that he's pushing for non-alignment, more United Nations cooperation amongst the countries, when it came to issues that were within his own country in the region of Kashmir, he didn't want the United Nations to involve themselves in that. So that's something that, like the challenge of having this non-alignment movement and still working in this idea of your own nation's interests. Okay, and then Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser is an Egyptian, another leader of the non-alignment movement. He supported the idea of pan-Arabism, and so he's calling for the unification of all Arab states, so from North Africa and the Middle East and such, because they share mostly common religion, mostly common culture. The use of Arabic writing and such has spread, after the Muhammad and the spreading of Islam across North Africa, Middle East, and of course into other parts of Africa too, and Central Asia and so forth. But he's putting this idea of pan-Arabism, that the Arab countries should unite together in working in their own self-interest as well. So more international cooperation. So it's important to note that it wasn't just about these two sides during the Cold War. There are lots of other countries involved, both all promoting something of different types of unity around the world. Okay, so let's go back to our essential question one more time. This is the questions I want you to answer in Canvas: is how did the Cold War shape the modern world, and to what extent did the Cold War involve the entire world? So those are two questions I would like you to respond to, and that concludes topic 8.2. We'll get into topic 8.3 next. Hope everyone is healthy and safe, and I will see you when I see you. Chromebooks are slow. There we go.